must have gone in the library sometime. I had to. I was born in San Francisco in 1925. I always used to think there was a plaque in front of the hospital that's commemorated this, but I don't think it's there anymore. I think they tore the hospital down. But we lived in San Francisco for probably 2 or 3 years because my mother and father was from there, and then moved to Los Angeles for about 10 years or so, and ended up here in Sacramento in 1937, and I was like 13 years old. Essentially, the country was coming out of the Depression, more or less. My dad fared pretty well because he was a druggist. He graduated from college, I think, in about 1922. But he was always able to have a job. It didn't pay much, but he had a job throughout the bad days of the Depression. And then when he came up here, I think it's interesting as a matter of history is in 1937 he was transferred up here from a little chain of drugstores in Los Angeles to operate their local store, Sontag Drugs, on K Street in Sacramento. And after a while, he kind of got the bug that he wanted to open his own store, because he had been working in drugstores for 10 or 12 years or something like that. And he had no money. And that was the thing that always gave me a lot of faith. You could do things without having a lot of money. He had zero money to open that drugstore, believe me. He borrowed $1,000 from his brother, who was a doctor, and got a couple of my mother's brother's uncles types to sign credit for about $500 each. Talked the ice cream company into financing the building of the soda fountain, and managed to scurry up enough credit to stock the store, and he opened I remember actually being there, setting the store up, and we had like one of this, one tube of toothpaste, and one bottle of aspirin, and so on. But it started off infinitely tiny. The drugstore itself wasn't very big. When you think of all the stuff that he managed to get in there, which you see now in the modern drugstores today, you see this vast variety of things. That store was only 1,600 square feet. And half of that, or a quarter of it, I guess, was the pharmacy part. And the rest of it was everything else, including a soda fountain. And you just jammed every imaginable kind of thing into that store, which was a prelude basically to what great drugstores are today. I mean, he had toys, and he had liquor, and he had magazines, and he has cosmetics and perfumes and sundry items, and later on records, of course, and on and on. Well, during high school, me and several other kids, there's always that group that decide they want to be photographers. So I was a school photographer, sort of, doing things for the yearbook and the paper. And I always liked photography from the time I was about 15 years old. So that's what that's all about. Well, the problem was I got there every day, which didn't make them terribly happy, but I didn't get there till about 10 o'clock. So I could only go to the third period. Then fourth period was lunch. So I'd go home for lunch, and there wasn't much point in going back for fifth. So I sort of missed a lot of classes in that way. Most of the time I was hanging around the drugstore. That was really it. See, in other words, I wasn't hanging out in the streets and, being a normal truant. When I wasn't in school or asleep, I was in the drugstore working and doing stuff, if you will, around the store, from behind the soda fountain to sweeping the floor to stocking the shelves, and the things that you do around there. And then later on, by 1941, I think, we put records in. So then I spent more time, phonograph records, and I spent a lot of time then sort of behind the record counter. It was a kind of an accident. We had a jukebox on the soda fountain, and it was a little 12 selection counter Wurlitzer. And one day, my dad said, "Well, why don't we?" Told the jukebox operator, "Why don't we sell the used records that you take off of the jukebox?" And so we started selling used records, and the operator sold them to us for 3 cents, and we sold them for a dime, and that went on for a few months. And then he said, my dad said again, I have to say that, well, if we can sell used records, why don't we sell new records? And his drugstore was a kind of a drugstore that had everything. I mean, they had everything: soda fountain, cosmetics, film, liquor, magazines. You know, drugs was almost a second thought. But the idea of selling records sort of appealed to him, and of course it certainly appealed to me, because I was just growing up into that point where I was beginning to become aware of music and popular artists and all that sort of thing. So that's how that got started. It was really unusual at the time. I mean, drugstores didn't carry music. I mean, that was a whole different thing. And actually, the record companies, the big record companies like RCA and Victor and so on, they were pretty snobby about the whole thing. They didn't think that their music belonged in a drugstore. I mean, after all, it was supposed to be in a music store because it was precious, and we didn't think it was very precious somehow. Remember, 78 RPM records sold for 35 cents and 50 cents. So it wasn't a big deal. People, it was easy enough for people to buy them. And even though the wholesalers or the music companies were a little shocked that a drugstore would want to sell records, because after all, records belong to the music store, they got over it quick, and we began to grow from a very tiny little counter in the middle of the drugstore to a space. During the war, my dad broke through and created a little space next door to the store for the music department, and which wasn't very big, like 600 square feet or so. And so from that point on, it just, kind of enlarged and grew. Everybody went in the Army or the Navy or something, during the war. So when you're 18, you went in the Army, or you went into service, I should say. So I did, and I was only in for 2 years. It was near the end of the war, because I ended up going in 1944, and mostly went through various training schools. And by the time I was out of training school and ready for an assignment of some sort, why, the war was happily over. So then I just came back and went to work again in the drugstore. The way it worked, if you enlisted before you were 18, you were allowed to stay in some kind of a school for 6 months or so before they brought you into regular service. And so I was, when I have to backtrack a bit, when McClatchy, the school, decided they didn't want me around anymore, and then they said, well, you're too young, you have to go to school of some sort. So they transferred me out to the city college, and I took a couple of classes out there, and then later on, when time came along to this enlistment deal, I decided to go to photo school in Los Angeles. And I attended art photo school actually in Los Angeles, Art Center, and for a few months, with the idea in mind that when I went into the service, that maybe I could get a job as a photographer or in the photo department. The ironic thing about it is they decided, you didn't decide where you went, they decided for you. So they decided to train me as a radio and radar operator, a radar mechanic, really. And funny enough, I ended up in the photo squadron as a radar mechanic, but then the war ended, so I didn't do anything. I always like to say that I went in the Army, but we won the war in spite of me.